The champagne glass was still in his hand when Cha Do-jin's knees gave out. He didn't stumble. He didn't reach for the table. 1 second he was standing at the head of the engagement hall, lifting his glass to the woman he was about to marry, and the next second his body folded forward like something had been cut inside him, and his face went straight into the 3-tier engagement cake behind him. The crash of porcelain. The gasp that rippled through 300 guests like a wave hitting a wall. Frosting smeared across his cheek as his head hit the table edge on the way down, and then he was on the marble floor, not moving, one arm bent wrong beneath him. For exactly 2 seconds, nobody in that hall breathed. Then Yoon Se-ah screamed his name, and the room exploded. Bodyguards shoved through the crowd of Korea's wealthiest families. Someone knocked over a chair. A waiter dropped a tray of glasses and the sound of it shattering only added to the panic. Kim Tae-sung was the first one through, dropping to his knees beside his boss, pressing 2 fingers to his neck, shouting orders nobody could hear over the chaos. Call the doctor. Now. Clear this room. Se-ah was on the floor too, in her white engagement dress, hands hovering over Do-jin's chest like she was afraid to touch him. Her mascara ran in thin black lines down her face. To everyone watching, it looked exactly like what it was supposed to look like, a woman watching her future collapse in front of her. By the time the private physician arrived 20 minutes later, the hall had been cleared of everyone except family. The doctor knelt over Do-jin's body for a long time, checking his pupils, his pulse, running his hands along his skull where it had struck the table. Then he stood, and said the 4 words that would change everything. He has fallen into a coma. The cry that came out of Se-ah was loud enough to reach the hallway. She collapsed into Tae-sung's arms, sobbing, repeating Do-jin's name like a prayer. Relatives wept. One of Do-jin's aunts had to be helped into a chair. Within the hour, the entire mansion staff knew. By morning, half of Seoul's underworld knew. Cha Do-jin, the man feared by rival families, government officials, and his own board of executives, was lying in a hospital bed with a tube in his arm and a machine quietly counting his heartbeats for him. Everyone cried that first night. Everyone except Se-ah, once the cameras and crying relatives were gone. The hidden security feed, the one only Tae-sung had access to, captured her walking into Do-jin's private room at 2 a.m. She stood at the foot of his bed for a long moment, glancing once toward the door to make sure it was locked. Then she leaned down close to his ear, close enough that her perfume would have filled his senses if he were actually unconscious, and she whispered the words that the camera caught in crystal clarity. I waited long enough. Everything is finally mine. She straightened up, fixed her hair in the dark window's reflection, and walked out of the room like a woman who had just confirmed good news. What nobody in that mansion knew, not Se-ah, not the relatives circling like vultures, not even most of his own men, was that Cha Do-jin's eyes were closed, but his mind was completely, perfectly awake. He had heard every word. If you believe true love should stay even when everything falls apart, even in the hardest moments, subscribe right now and tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching this from, because this story is about to take you somewhere you won't expect. 3 days before the engagement party, Do-jin had been walking past Se-ah's private sitting room when he heard her voice through the half-open door, light and laughing, talking to her closest friend on the phone. Love? Please, she'd said, the sound of her nail file scraping in the background. Marrying Cha Do-jin means security for life. Do you know what kind of money we're talking about? Love has nothing to do with it. Do-jin had stood frozen in that hallway for almost a full minute. He told himself it meant nothing. Every woman who married into power knew what she was marrying. He had known that too, when he proposed. But something about hearing it said so easily, so carelessly, with her friend laughing on the other end, had planted a small, cold seed in his chest that he couldn't shake. That same week, Tae-sung had come to him privately, his voice low even though they were alone in Do-jin's office. Boss. I need you to hear this. Taesung had set a folder on the desk, hands tense. There are people inside the organization talking. Money moving where it shouldn't. Names I trust mentioned in places I don't like. Doojin had stared at the folder for a long time without opening it. You think it's more than one person? I think, Taesung said carefully, that if something happened to you tomorrow, I don't know who in this house would grieve you, and who would already be dividing up what's yours. The word sat in Doojin's chest next to the cold seed Seiya had planted days earlier, and by the time the engagement party arrived, a plan had already formed in his mind, reckless, theatrical, the kind of plan only a man with nothing left to lose and everything left to prove would attempt. He staged the appearance of an assassination attempt during a private meeting 2 days before the party, just enough of a head injury on record to make a coma medically plausible. Only his physician and Taesung knew the full truth. Everyone else, including the woman he was about to marry, would believe exactly what they were meant to believe. He wanted to see, once and for all, who he had actually built his life around. What he learned in the first week made his blood run cold in a different way than any rival ever had. The executives who had sworn loyalty to him for a decade began circling each other in boardrooms like sharks smelling blood, fighting over who would take temporary control. Relatives he barely spoke to twice a year suddenly remembered they were family, showing up at the mansion gates demanding access to his accounts, just in case anything happens. 2 of his most trusted associates had already begun quietly skimming funds from accounts they assumed nobody was watching. And Seiya began redecorating the mansion within 4 days. She had her assistant bring in new curtains, new furniture, a new color scheme for the master suite, and then, with a confidence that made even the household staff exchange uneasy glances, she moved her things into Doojin's bedroom. The room where, technically, her dying fiancé was supposed to return to recover. Through the hidden microphones Taesung had installed in the hospital room and later in the mansion suite where Doojin's recovery was arranged, Doojin listened to her on the phone with a wedding planner. We may need to postpone the wedding indefinitely, she said smoothly. Given the circumstances. Though between us, I think we should start discussing whether it happens at all. Lying motionless on that bed, machines beeping steadily beside him, Doojin felt something in his chest harden into stone. In the middle of all that, the greed, the vultures, the woman who had already mentally buried him, there was one person in that mansion who didn't change at all. Her name was Nia James, one of the household maids, a quiet Nigerian woman who had worked there for almost 2 years without Doojin ever really noticing her. She moved through the house like she always had. She cleaned his room every morning at the same time. She changed the flowers on his bedside table without being asked. She adjusted his blanket gently, the way you would for someone who might actually wake up cold. In the afternoons, she read the newspaper aloud to him, her voice low and steady, stumbling occasionally over difficult Korean words and laughing softly at her own mistakes. She never once gossiped about the chaos happening around her. She never asked for anything. Doojin, lying there pretending to be unreachable, found himself genuinely surprised that he couldn't remember her face clearly from before all this. He had lived in that mansion for years and somehow never truly seen the woman who, every single day, sat beside him like he mattered. Every night, after her shift technically ended, Nia came back. She thought, like many people do, that coma patients could still hear. So she talked to him. Not formally, not performing for an audience, she talked the way you'd talk to an old friend at the end of a long day. She told him about her childhood in Lagos, the heat, the noise of her grandmother's market stall, the year they didn't have enough money for new shoes and she wore her brother's old ones to school until the other kids stopped teasing her about it. She told him funny things that happened in the kitchen that day, Mrs. Choi nearly setting off the smoke alarm trying a new soup recipe, one of the junior maids slipping on a wet floor and landing directly in a laundry basket. She practiced Korean phrases on him, mangling the pronunciation deliberately just to hear herself laugh in the empty room. She told him about her mother, gone now for almost 8 years, and how much she still reached for the phone some evenings before remembering there was no one to call. And sometimes, she scolded him. "You know," she said one night, straightening his pillow with more force than necessary, "everyone in this house is terrified of you, Mr. Cha. Even now. Even like this. Honestly, you should have smiled more. Just a little. It wouldn't have killed you." Lying there with his eyes closed, Cha Do-jin laughed. Not out loud. Not where anyone could hear it. But somewhere deep in his chest, for the first time in longer than he could remember, something moved that felt dangerously close to joy. He found himself, against every instinct of a man who trusted no one, waiting through the long hours of each day for the sound of her footsteps coming back down that hallway. It didn't last without consequence. Seiya had ordered most of the heavy antique furniture removed from Do-jin's room, pieces that had belonged to his late mother, replaced with sleeker, more modern items that matched her new vision for the house. Nia, normally so careful to stay invisible, found herself objecting. "Ma'am, these were Mr. Cha's mother's things." "I don't think." "You don't think," Seiya cut her off, voice sharp enough to draw stares from the other staff in the hallway, "because it isn't your job to think. It's your job to clean. Do you understand the difference, or should I explain it again more slowly?" Nia bowed her head and apologized, the way she always did, the way a woman with no power in a house like this had learned to do a long time ago. But that night, after the house had gone quiet, she went down to the storage room where the old furniture had been moved, and one by one, she carried pieces of it back up to Do-jin's room. A wooden jewelry box. A framed photograph. A small, worn lamp. He should wake up surrounded by people who love him, she murmured to herself, setting the lamp gently back in its place. Not strangers rearranging his life like he's already gone. Lying motionless under the covers, Do-jin felt something crack open behind his ribs. Then came the night that nearly stopped his heart for real. Nia sat beside his bed as she always did, holding his hand the way she sometimes did when the room felt particularly heavy with silence. Her voice, when it came, was different than usual, quieter, almost afraid to say what it was saying. "You saved my life once," she whispered. "I never got the chance to thank you properly." Do-jin's mind went still. Saved her? He had no memory of this woman before she became a name on his household payroll. He searched every corner of his memory and found nothing, no encounter, no rescue, no reason a quiet maid in his own house would owe him her life. But her hand was trembling slightly around his, and her voice carried a weight that wasn't performance. Whatever she was talking about, she believed it completely. For the first time since this entire elaborate test began, Cha Do-jin genuinely did not know what was happening in his own house. The hidden cameras kept feeding him truth, and the truth kept getting darker. Taesung brought him updated footage, reviewed in secret during the hours the mansion thought their boss was unreachable. Seiya, dressed down and careful, slipping out a side entrance to meet a black car parked 2 streets away. Inside that car, Chairman Park Hyun-chul, a man whose smile had fooled boardrooms for 30 years and whose ambitions Do-jin had quietly blocked more than once. The audio was grainy but clear enough. "Once Do-jin dies," Seiya said, leaning toward Park with an ease that turned Do-jin's stomach, "everything becomes much easier. The board won't fight me if I come with your backing. Taesung is the only real obstacle, and he can be removed." "And the information I asked for?" Park's voice, smooth and patient. "I'll have access to his private servers within the week. Once I'm officially in control of the estate." Do-jin sat with that recording for a long time after Taesung left the room. The woman he had planned to marry was not simply indifferent to his death. She was actively building toward it, with the one man in Seoul who had spent a decade trying to dismantle everything Do-jin's father built. And somehow, in the middle of all that betrayal, it was the maid who kept saving small, broken pieces of his mother's room and reading him the newspaper like he was still a person worth talking to. Seo noticed. She noticed the way Nia lingered in Do-jin's room longer than her duties required. She noticed the new lamp, the return jewelry box, details that didn't match her redecorating plans. Jealousy, mixed with something colder and more calculating, settled into her expression the next morning when she called Nia into the main hall in front of the rest of the staff. "I think it's time we addressed something," Seo said, voice carrying easily across the marble floor. "I've noticed you spending an unusual amount of time alone with my fiancé. Touching him. Talking to him. Returning items I specifically had removed." She let the silence stretch, watching Nia's face carefully. "Are you trying to seduce a man who can't even open his eyes? Is that what this is?" A ripple of shocked whispers moved through the staff. Nia's face went pale, then very still. "Ma'am, I would never." "You're done here," Seo said simply. "Pack your things. I want you out by tonight." Mrs. Choi, the head housekeeper who had watched Nia grow from a frightened new hire into one of the gentlest souls in that house, tried to intervene quietly afterward, catching Seo in the hallway. "She has nowhere else to go," Mrs. Choi said, voice low and pleading. "Her family is gone. This job is everything she has." "Then she should have thought of that before overstepping her place," Seo replied, and walked away without looking back. That night, before Nia left the mansion for what she believed would be the last time, she asked permission to say goodbye to a man who couldn't hear her. The new housekeeping supervisor, not wanting trouble, allowed it. She sat beside his bed one final time, tears slipping freely down her face now, no longer caring who might walk in. "Thank you," she whispered, "for saving me all those years ago. I hope, whenever you wake up, you find someone who actually loves you. Someone who deserves what you tried to give them." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small handmade charm, old, slightly faded, clearly something she had carried for a very long time. She placed it gently in his open palm and folded his fingers around it. Then she walked out, and the sound of the front gate closing behind her was the loneliest sound Do-jin had heard in years. The moment her footsteps faded completely down the driveway, Do-jin opened his eyes for the first time since the engagement party. If you think Nia deserves better than what this house has given her, like this video right now and tell us in the comments, because what happens next is going to break your heart before it heals it. Do-jin didn't waste another hour. He called Tae-sung into the room the moment he was certain no one else was near, and gave him one instruction that mattered more than anything happening with the board, the money, or Seo's betrayal. Find out everything about Nia James. Everything. Tonight. What Tae-sung brought back 2 days later didn't just answer Do-jin's questions, it tore open a part of his past he had buried so deep he'd genuinely forgotten it existed. 10 years earlier, a 17-year-old Nia had arrived in Korea on the promise of a job that didn't exist. Trafficked through a network that preyed on young women desperate enough to believe a stranger's promises, she had been held for nearly 3 weeks before a chance, violent intersection of fate changed everything. Do-jin, 28 at the time and far from the controlled, calculating boss he'd become, had been handling a different piece of business entirely on a rain-soaked night near the docks, a debt collection that had nothing to do with trafficking. He'd stumbled, almost by accident, onto the scene where 2 men were dragging a terrified, injured girl toward a van. He hadn't known her name. He hadn't known her story. He had simply seen something happening that even a young Mafia enforcer's conscience couldn't walk past. He'd broken the arm of one trafficker and put the other on the ground hard enough that he didn't get up quickly, and then he'd driven the girl himself to the nearest hospital, paid the bill in cash before anyone could ask questions, arranged legal assistance through a contact who owed him a favor, and quietly covered 3 months of temporary housing until she was stable enough to start over. Then he had walked away and never thought of it again. To him, it had been one chaotic night among hundreds. He'd never even asked her name. To Nia, It had been the night her entire life was saved by a stranger who vanished before she could properly see his face in the dark and rain. She had spent years afterward trying to rebuild herself, and somewhere along the way, she had learned through quiet inquiry exactly who that stranger was. When a position opened in his household 2 years ago, she had taken it, not for money, not for status, but for the simple, aching need to be near the man who had given her a second chance at living, even if he never remembered doing it. The charm she'd left in his hand was the same one she had made during her hospital recovery all those years ago, kept safe through a decade of rebuilding her life, carried as a private reminder that kindness, however small to the person who gave it, can be the entire reason someone else survives. Cha Do-jin sat with that charm clutched in his fist and cried for the first time since he was a boy. Not from grief. From the staggering, humbling realization that the one person in his entire mansion who had shown him real, unconditional devotion had been quietly repaying a debt he didn't even remember creating, while the woman he'd chosen to marry had been counting the days until his death. There was no time to sit with that revelation for long. Chairman Park's network was efficient, and word eventually reached him that Cha Do-jin's coma might not be as absolute as everyone believed, a nervous slip from a junior staff member, a question asked in the wrong place. Park didn't wait to confirm it. He moved immediately, sending armed men to the mansion that same night, calculating that if Do-jin truly was waking up, the safest move was to eliminate the threat before it became undeniable. Taesung burst into Do-jin's room with 2 armed guards behind him, breathless. "Boss, we need to move you now. Park's men are already past the outer gate." "Where's Nia?" Do-jin was already on his feet, the 4 ripped from his arm, voice harder than Taesung had heard it in weeks. "She left 2 nights ago, boss. We need to find her first." It was too late. Park's men, working a separate angle, had already located Nia at the small rented room she'd taken after losing her job, operating on the theory that if she'd been close to Do-jin during his coma, she might know something valuable about his true condition. They took her quietly, efficiently, the kind of operation designed to leave no trace and no witnesses. When Taesung's contact confirmed it, a grainy phone camera image of Nia being forced into a van 2 streets from her apartment, Do-jin didn't hesitate for even a second. The fake coma, the careful months of deception, all of it evaporated in an instant. "Get every available man," he said, voice low and absolutely lethal. "Cha Do-jin is awake. Let the entire underworld know it tonight." Within hours, word spread through Seoul's criminal networks like wildfire. The boss everyone believed was dying had risen, and he was furious. The operation to recover Nia was brutal and fast, Do-jin himself leading the team that stormed the warehouse where Park's men had taken her, refusing to wait safely behind his own guards the way Taesung begged him to. He found her tied to a chair in a cold concrete room, bruised along one cheekbone, eyes wide with disbelief the moment she saw who had just kicked the door open. "You were awake?" Her voice cracked on the words, disbelief warring with something far more painful underneath it. Do-jin cut her restraints himself, hands gentler than anyone in that warehouse would have believed possible from a man who had just put 3 armed men on the ground to get to her. "Nia, let me explain." "You were awake," she said again, louder this time, pulling her wrists free and standing on shaking legs. "All those nights. Everything I told you. My mother. My childhood. The charm. You heard all of it and you said nothing?" "I didn't know how to." "I trusted you," she said, and the betrayal in her voice was sharper than any blade he'd faced in years. "Even unconscious, even thinking you couldn't hear a word, I trusted you completely. And you let me believe you couldn't." She walked past him, out of that cold warehouse and into the night, and for the first time in his entire life, Cha Do-jin, a man feared across an entire criminal underworld, didn't know how to stop someone from walking away. "After everything you just watched, would you forgive Cha Do-jin? Comment yes or no below, and tell us why, because what he does next might just change your answer." The fallout came fast once Doo-jin's awakening became public knowledge. Within a week, he had assembled every piece of evidence Taesung's surveillance had gathered, the recordings of Sea's conversations with Chairman Park, the financial transfers, the explicit plans to seize his empire and remove anyone loyal to him. He released it not through legal channels alone but through every back channel that mattered in Seoul's business and criminal circles simultaneously, making certain there was no quiet way for either of them to survive the exposure. Sea lost everything within a month. The engagement was publicly dissolved under circumstances that made any future marriage into Seoul's elite social circles functionally impossible. Chairman Park's business empire, built on decades of careful manipulation, began unraveling as partners who valued Doo-jin's continued goodwill more than Park's promises quietly cut ties. But exposing them didn't fix what had cracked open in Doo-jin himself. Over the following months, something in him shifted in ways even Taesung struggled to recognize. Doo-jin began restructuring the criminal side of his empire, slowly, carefully, divesting from the most violent and exploitative operations his organization had built its foundation on. It wasn't a dramatic, public transformation. There was no press conference, no announcement. It was quiet. Deliberate. A man systematically dismantling the parts of his life that had never actually made him feel like anything except powerful and alone. He started funding survivor support programs for victims of trafficking, the very crime that had nearly destroyed Nia's life a decade earlier. He didn't put his name on any of it. No plaques, no donor walls, nothing that would trace back to Cha Doo-jin the Mafia boss. He simply funded it, quietly, consistently, because somewhere in those long silent months pretending to be unconscious, he had learned exactly what it cost a person to survive something terrible alone, and exactly what it meant when one person chose, against all reason, to come back and sit with you anyway. Nia, meanwhile, had rebuilt her life again, the way she always seemed to find a way to do. She found steady work, kept mostly to herself, and tried hard not to think about a man with closed eyes who had heard every secret she'd ever whispered into a quiet hospital room. One afternoon, almost by accident, she visited a community support center that had recently opened for trafficking survivors, a place she'd heard about through a friend, offering counseling and job placement for women rebuilding exactly the kind of life she'd had to build twice now. She walked through the doors expecting nothing more than information. She found Cha Doo-jin standing in the small kitchen area, sleeves rolled up, no bodyguards trailing him, no expensive suit marking him as anything other than an ordinary man helping pour coffee for the women who'd come in that day. He looked up and saw her, and for a long moment, neither of them moved. "You funded this place," she said finally, not a question. "I should have told you everything, from the very first night you mentioned saving you," he said quietly, setting down the coffee pot. "I should have woken up the moment I realized who you were to me. Instead I let you walk out of that mansion thinking nobody heard you, when the truth is I heard every single word, and none of them left me the same. You let me believe." "I know." He stepped closer, voice rough with something he clearly wasn't used to feeling. "You spent 10 years quietly repaying a kindness I didn't even remember giving you. Let me spend the rest of my life trying to earn the one you actually gave me." Nia's eyes filled, and for a long moment she said nothing at all, the weight of everything, the betrayal, the years of silent devotion, the rescue she'd never forgotten and he barely remembered, settling somewhere between them in that small, ordinary kitchen. Finally, she wiped her eyes and managed a small, watery laugh. "We'll start with coffee," she said. It wasn't forgiveness. Not completely, not yet. But it was a door left open, and for a man who had spent his entire adult life slamming doors shut to protect himself, it was the first genuine smile to cross Cha Doo-jin's face in longer than anyone around him could remember. 6 months later, Mrs. Choi walked into the mansion kitchen to find the most feared crime boss in Seoul standing over a pot of jollof rice with an expression of pure, undiluted terror on his face, while Nia James leaned against the counter laughing so hard she had to hold onto the edge for balance. "You're burning it," she managed between laughs. I am not burning it, Doo-jin said, with the same deadly seriousness he once reserved for boardroom negotiations, stirring the pot like it might explode. Mrs. Choi backed quietly out of the kitchen, smiling to herself, leaving the two of them to it. Because the man who had once faced down rival bosses and corrupt chairmen without blinking was, in that moment, more afraid of burning dinner for the woman he loved than he had ever been of losing everything else he owned. And somewhere in that simple, ordinary fear, he had finally found the one thing his empire had never been able to give him. If this story touched your heart even a little, don't forget to subscribe, like this video, and share it with someone who still believes that genuine kindness, the kind given without expecting anything back, really can change a life forever.